The crimson sun bled through the cockpit glass as I pulled my P-400 into a steep dive, the Japanese Zero growing larger in my gun sight with each heartbeat. At 3,000 feet above the Solomon Sea, with enemy tracers slicing the air around me like deadly fireflies, I squeezed the trigger and felt the 37mm cannon buck against my chest. The Zero's wing folded like paper, and I watched the rising sun disappear into the waves below. That was February 1943, and everyone said we couldn't beat the Zeros. That morning, flying out of Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, we proved them wrong. My name is Lieutenant Johnny McKenzie, and I flew with the 67th Fighter Squadron, the Fighting Cocks, during some of the darkest days of the Pacific War. When I tell people about those months on Guadalcanal, they usually want to hear about the glory, the victories, the headlines back home. But the truth is, most days we were just trying to survive long enough to get our beat-up Airacobras airborne one more time. It was dawn on February 7, 1943, when Major Jim Robinson burst into our tent with news that would change everything. The Japanese were making another run down the slot, that narrow channel between the Solomon Islands that had become a highway of death for both sides. Intelligence reported a massive convoy, 22 destroyers loaded with reinforcements and supplies, escorted by at least 25 Zero fighters from the cracked 204th Kakutai. "Gentlemen," Robinson announced, his weathered face grim in the morning light filtering through our canvas walls. "This is it. This is our chance to cut the head off the snake." I rolled out of my cot, my body aching from yesterday's mission. At 23, I already felt like an old man. 6 months of combat flying in the Solomons would do that to you. Around me, 12 other pilots stirred, all that remained of our original 24-man squadron. The rest were either dead, wounded, or had been shipped home with combat fatigue. "What's our situation, Major?" asked Captain Tom Bradley, my wingman and closest friend since flight training back in Alabama. Tom had a wife and 2 kids waiting for him in Montgomery, and he carried their picture in his flight suit pocket, right over his heart. Robinson spread a worn map across the wooden crate we used as a table. Red circles marked Japanese positions up and down the slot, while blue X's showed our own bases scattered across the southern Solomons. "Intelligence says the convoy left Rabaul at 0200 hours, he continued, tracing his finger along the enemy's likely route. 22 destroyers in 3 groups, moving at high speed. They'll reach our patrol zone around 0800, just as the sun comes up full. Perfect timing for a surprise attack." I studied the map, calculating distances and fuel consumption in my head. It would be tight, very tight. Our P-400s weren't built for long-range missions. With a combat radius of barely 200 miles, we'd have maybe 10 minutes over the target before we'd have to turn for home or risk running out of fuel over shark-infested waters. "Sir, what about fighter escort for the convoy?" I asked, knowing the answer would determine whether we lived or died. 25 Zeros, maybe more. Latest intelligence suggests they're flying cover at 15,000 feet, with combat air patrols rotating every hour. The tent fell silent. Everyone knew what that meant. The A6M0 was still the most feared fighter in the Pacific. Fast, maneuverable, and flown by experienced pilots, the Zero had dominated Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor. Our P-400s, export versions of the P-39 Airacobra originally built for Britain, were heavy, clumsy, and underpowered compared to the sleek Japanese fighters. But we had advantages the Zeros didn't. Our planes were built like flying tanks, with armor plating behind the pilot's seat and self-sealing fuel tanks that could take punishment and keep flying. The 37 cannon mounted in our nose could punch holes through a Zero's thin aluminum skin with a single hit. Most importantly, we were fighting for our home field, our supply lines, and our brothers who couldn't fly anymore. "Here's the plan," Robinson continued, his voice cutting through our grim thoughts. "We'll take off at 0630 hours in 2 flights of 7 aircraft each. I'll lead red flight at high altitude, 12,000 feet. McKenzie, you'll lead blue flight low, hugging the deck at 500 feet. I nodded, understanding the strategy immediately. The high flight would draw the attention of the Zero escorts, engaging them in a dogfight that would pull them away from their bombers. Meanwhile, my low-level flight would slip under the Japanese radar and hit the convoy with everything we had. Remember, gentlemen, Robinson concluded, those destroyers are loaded with reinforcements bound for our sector. If they get through, we'll be facing fresh Japanese troops and supplies within days. This isn't just another mission. This is our chance to turn the tide. An hour later, I stood beside my aircraft in the great pre-dawn darkness, running through my pre-flight checklist by the light of a flickering flashlight. My P-400, tail number 335, had taken me through 37 combat missions without letting me down. She wasn't pretty, olive drab paint peeling, patches covering bullet holes, and oil stains darkening the concrete beneath her belly, but she was mine. Staff Sergeant Mike O'Sullivan, my crew chief, emerged from beneath the wing with a wrench in his oil-stained hands. "She's ready to go." "Lieutenant," he said with his thick Boston accent. "Fresh ammo for all guns. Full fuel, and I patched that hole in your starboard wing from yesterday's mission." "Thanks, Sully," I replied, clapping him on the shoulder. "Any word from maintenance on those engine problems?" O'Sullivan's face darkened. "Still running rough at altitude, sir." "Best I can figure, it's the supercharger. She'll give you full power up, toting 1,000 feet, but don't expect much above that." I nodded grimly. Most air combat in the Pacific took place above 15,000 feet, where the Zeros had a decisive advantage. Flying low would help, but it also meant we'd be sitting ducks if any Japanese fighters broke through to attack us. The other pilots of Blue Flight gathered around my aircraft as the eastern horizon began to show the first pale traces of dawn. These were the men I'd flown with for months, shared tents with, and watched grow from green replacements into hardened veterans. There was Lieutenant Billy Walsh from Chicago, barely 19, but already credited with 3 kills. Lieutenant Sam Rodriguez from El Paso, a former mechanic who could nurse a damaged aircraft home when everyone else had given up. And Captain Tom Bradley, steady as a rock and the best wingman a pilot could ask for. "All right, listen up," I called out, keeping my voice low as enemy submarines were known to prowl these waters at night, potentially carrying reconnaissance teams. "We're going in fast and low, following the northern coast of Florida Island until we reach the target area. Once we spot the convoy, we'll split into 2 elements. Tom and Billy, you take the lead destroyers. Sam and I will hit the trailing ships." I pulled out my worn map, pointing to our route with the tip of my finger. "Remember, those destroyers have serious anti-aircraft defenses, dual-purpose 5-inch guns, 25mm cannon, and machine guns. They'll throw up a wall of flak the moment they see us coming. Our only advantage is surprise and speed." "What about the Zeros, Johnny?" Walsh asked, his young face betraying the nervousness we all felt. "Major Robinson's flight will keep them busy upstairs," I replied with more confidence than I felt. "But if any breakthrough, remember your training. The Zero can outturn us, but we're faster in a dive and our planes can take more punishment. If you get jumped, dive for the deck and head for home. Don't try to dogfight them at altitude." As if summoned by our conversation, the distant rumble of aircraft engines began to echo across Henderson Field. Robinson's red flight was starting their engines, preparing for takeoff. The sound sent a familiar mixture of adrenaline and fear coursing through my veins, the same feeling I'd experienced before every combat mission since arriving on Guadalcanal. "Time to go, gentlemen," I announced, pulling on my flight helmet and adjusting my radio headset. "Check your oxygen, test your guns, and remember, we're fighting for every Marine, sailor, and soldier on this island. They're counting on us." One by one, we climbed into our cockpits as the sky gradually lightened from black to deep purple. The familiar routine of strapping in, adjusting mirrors, and running through the engine start procedure helped calm my nerves. Around me, 6 other P-400s roared to life, their Allison V1710 engines coughing black smoke before settling into a steady rumble. At exactly 0630 hours, Major Robinson's voice crackled through my radio headset. "Iron Birds, this is Iron Leader. Red flight is rolling. Blue flight, you're cleared for takeoff in 2 minutes." I watched Robinson's 7 aircraft taxi to the runway, their navigation lights blinking in the gray dawn. One by one, they accelerated down Henderson's steel-matted runway and lifted into the morning sky, climbing steadily toward the northeast. In the distance, I could see storm clouds building over the ocean, another challenge we'd have to face. "Blue flight, this is Blue Leader," I called into my radio microphone. "Form up for takeoff. We're going hunting." My P-400 lurched forward as I released the brakes and pushed the throttle to maximum power. The Allison engine responded with a satisfying roar, and within seconds we were airborne, climbing into the pearl gray sky above Guadalcanal. Below us, Henderson Field shrank to a brown scar cut into the green jungle, surrounded by the wrecks of aircraft and the fresh graves of too many good men. As we formed up in loose formation, I couldn't help but think about how different this war was from what we'd expected back in flight school. The movies and magazines back home made it seem like aerial combat was all about individual heroics and dramatic dogfights. The reality was far more complex, a deadly chess game played at 300 miles per hour, where one mistake could mean not just your own death, but the deaths of the men depending on you. We flew northeast for 20 minutes, staying low over the water to avoid detection. The ocean below was a deep blue, broken by whitecaps and the occasional wake of a friendly patrol boat. To our left, the jungle-covered mountains of Guadalcanal rose like green walls, still partially shrouded in morning mist. At 0710 hours, Tom's voice came through my headset. "Johnny, I've got contacts bearings of 45 degrees. Looks like a lot of ships." I strained my eyes against the morning glare and finally spotted them, a line of dark shapes moving across the horizon like deadly water bugs. The Japanese convoy was exactly where intelligence had predicted, steaming at high speed down the slot toward our sector of the Solomons. "I count 22 vessels," Rodriguez reported, his voice tight with concentration. "Destroyers in 3 groups, moving in column formation." Through my binoculars, I could make out details of the enemy ships. They were the newest class of Japanese destroyers, sleek, fast, and heavily armed. Each one carried supplies and reinforcements that could tip the balance of the war in the Solomons. More importantly, each one bristled with anti-aircraft weapons that could turn the sky into a death trap for attacking aircraft. "Blue flight, this is Blue Leader," I transmitted, making a final check of my weapons. "Target in sight. We're going in fast and low. Remember, 1 pass, maximum damage, then get out. Don't linger over the target." I pushed the nose of my P-400 down toward the waves, building up speed for our attack run. Behind me, 6 other aircraft followed, spread out in a loose line abreast formation that would allow us to hit multiple targets simultaneously. The ocean rushed past below us at barely 50 feet altitude, close enough that I could see the foam on individual wave crests. As we closed the distance to the convoy, details became clearer and more ominous. The destroyers were arranged in a defensive formation, with the most heavily laden ships in the center and the most powerful warships on the flanks. Streams of black smoke rose from their stacks, indicating maximum speed. They knew we were coming. At 2 miles out, the first muzzle flashes began winking from the Japanese ships. Anti-aircraft shells burst in the air ahead of us, creating dark puffs of smoke and sending shrapnel whistling through the morning air. The enemy gunners had spotted us despite our low-level approach. "Flak ahead," Walsh called out, his young voice cracking with tension. "Stay low and keep your speed up," I replied, pushing my throttle to the maximum and feeling my P-400 respond with a surge of power. We'll be through it in 30 seconds. The next few moments passed in a blur of violence and terror. The Japanese convoy erupted in a storm of anti-aircraft fire, 5-inch shells bursting at our altitude, 25mm cannons sending streams of tracers across our path, and machine guns chattering from every ship. The air became thick with smoke and metal fragments, while the sea below churned with the splashes of falling shell fragments. My aircraft shuddered as shrapnel peppered the wings and fuselage, but the armor plating held. Through the chaos, I could see the largest destroyer growing larger in my gun sight, a perfect target loaded with supplies and troops. At 500 yards, I lined up my shot and pressed the firing button. The 37mm cannon in my nose erupted with a satisfying thump, sending high explosive shells into the destroyer's superstructure. I watched pieces of metal and equipment fly through the air as my shells found their mark. Secondary explosions began blooming along the ship's deck as ammunition and fuel stores were hit. "Got him," I shouted into my radio, pulling up and over the burning destroyer. "Blue 2, you're cleared to attack." Tom Bradley's P-400 screamed past me, his guns blazing at another destroyer in the convoy. His 37mm cannon punched holes through the ship's hull plating, while his machine guns raked the deck with devastating effect. Sailors could be seen diving for cover as his shell swatted across the vessel from bow to stern. The other members of Blue Flight pressed their attacks with equal determination. Walsh's aircraft came in from the port side, targeting a destroyer that appeared to be carrying aircraft parts and fuel drums on its deck. His cannon shells ignited a massive explosion that sent flames hundreds of feet into the air. Rodriguez attacked from the opposite direction, his guns silencing several anti-aircraft positions with precise fire. But the Japanese weren't giving up without a fight. As we streaked across the convoy at mast height, every gun that could bear was firing at us. The air became a deadly web of tracers, shell bursts, and flying metal. Walsh's aircraft took a direct hit from a 25mm cannon, and I watched in horror as his port wing began trailing smoke and flame. "Billy, you're on fire," I called out. "Get out of there." "I'm okay. I'm okay," he replied, though his voice sounded strained. "Heading for home." I looked around frantically for other aircraft from Blue Flight and saw that we'd taken serious casualties. Rodriguez's P-400 was trailing smoke from its engine, while 2 other aircraft from our flight were nowhere to be seen. The convoy was a mess of burning ships and exploding ammunition, but we'd paid a heavy price for the damage we'd inflicted. "Blue Flight, this is Blue Leader," I transmitted. "Break off and head for home." Mission accomplished. As we turned away from the burning convoy, I looked back to assess the damage we'd caused. 4 Japanese destroyers were either sinking or burning heavily, while several others showed signs of serious damage. Most importantly, the convoy's formation had been broken, with ships scattering in different directions to avoid further attacks. But our victory celebration was cut short by an urgent transmission from Major Robinson's Red Flight. "All Iron Birds, this is Iron Leader. We've got problems up here. Zeros everywhere, and they're breaking through to attack the convoy." I looked up and saw the aerial battle raging at high altitude. Robinson's 7 P-400s were engaged in a desperate dogfight with what looked like at least 20 Japanese Zero fighters. Smoke trails marked the paths of aircraft in trouble, and I could see parachutes descending toward the ocean far below. Worse yet, several Zeros had broken away from the main battle and were diving toward our position. These weren't just any enemy pilots. Based on their aggressive tactics and precise formation flying, these were veterans from the elite 204th Kakutai, some of the best fighter pilots in the Imperial Japanese Navy. "Zeros coming down fast," Tom called out. 6 of them diving from our 2 o'clock high. I looked up and felt my blood run cold. The attacking Zeros were in a perfect diving attack formation, with their leader already lining up a shot on Walsh's damaged aircraft. At this altitude, and with our aircraft carrying battle damage, we were at a severe disadvantage against the nimble Japanese fighters. Blue flight, this is blue leader, I transmitted, making a split-second decision that I hoped wouldn't get us all killed. Form up defensive circle. We'll have to fight our way out. The next few minutes became a swirling aerial melee that tested every skill we'd learned in months of combat flying. The Zeros attacked in pairs, using their superior maneuverability to try to get on our tails for killing shots. But we'd learned a few tricks during our time in the Solomons. Instead of trying to outturn the Japanese fighters, we used our aircraft's superior diving speed and structural strength. When a Zero got behind one of us, we'd dive for the deck while our wingman came around to attack the pursuing enemy fighter. It was a deadly game of aerial tag, with the stakes being life and death. The first Zero made the mistake of trying to turn fight with Tom Bradley. Tom had learned not to play the game. Instead, he pushed his P-400 into a steep dive, building up speed as the Zero tried to follow. At 2,000 feet, Tom pulled out of his dive and climbed sharply, using his aircraft's superior power to weight ratio at low altitude to get above the pursuing fighter. As the Zero struggled to match Tom's climb, I came diving out of the sun with my guns blazing. My 37mm cannon shells struck the Japanese fighter's engine, and I watched pieces of the cowling fly away in a shower of sparks and metal. The Zero rolled over and dove toward the ocean, trailing a long plume of black smoke. "That's one," I called out, already looking for the next target. But the Japanese pilots were far from finished. The remaining 5 Zeros had regrouped and were pressing their attack with renewed fury. Their leader, flying an aircraft with distinctive red stripes on the wings, seemed determined to revenge his fallen comrade. This pilot was clearly a veteran. He knew better than to dive after our aircraft or try to match our straight-line speed. Instead, he used classic fighter tactics, climbing above us and waiting for the right moment to pounce. When Walsh's damaged aircraft fell behind the rest of the formation, the Japanese ace saw his chance. The Zero dove out of the morning sun like a striking hawk, its guns already firing before it came within effective range. Walsh saw the attack coming and tried to turn away, but his damaged aircraft couldn't respond quickly enough. The Zero's seven machine guns and 20mm cannon raked Walsh's P-400 from nose to tail, sending pieces of metal spinning through the air. "I'm hit bad," Walsh transmitted, his voice tight with pain. "Engines seizing up, and I've lost hydraulic pressure." I watched in helpless rage as Walsh's aircraft began trailing thick black smoke. The young pilot from Chicago was fighting to keep his crippled P-400 in the air, but it was a losing battle. Flames began licking back from the engine compartment, and his aircraft started a slow spiral toward the ocean. "Billy, get out of there," I called out. "Bail out." "Negative," Walsh replied, his voice surprisingly calm. "I can see some of those destroyers are still moving. I'm going to make sure they don't get away." Before any of us could stop him, Walsh pushed his burning P-400 into a shallow dive toward the Japanese convoy. The enemy ships began firing at his aircraft, but he pressed on through the wall of anti-aircraft fire. At the last moment, he lined up on the largest undamaged destroyer and dove straight into its superstructure. The explosion when Walsh's aircraft hit the Japanese ship was visible for miles. His remaining fuel and ammunition created a massive fireball that completely engulfed the destroyer's bridge and forward gun turrets. The ship immediately began listing to port and was clearly out of the fight. Walsh's sacrifice had eliminated another enemy ship, but it left us with only 5 aircraft against 4 remaining Zeros. The Japanese pilots seemed energized by their success and pressed their attack with increased aggression. The red-striped Zero came after me next, using a climbing attack that brought him up from below and behind, the most difficult angle to defend against. I saw him coming in my rearview mirror and threw my P-400 into a violent left turn, pulling enough G-forces to make my vision start to gray out around the edges. The Zero followed my turn, but his pilot made a crucial mistake. Instead of leading his shot properly, he fired too early and too far out of range. His 20mm cannon shells passed harmlessly behind my aircraft, while his muzzle flashes gave away his exact position. I chopped my throttle and pulled back hard on the stick, bleeding off speed and altitude in a desperate attempt to get behind the attacking fighter. The Japanese pilot, expecting me to try to run, overshot my position and found himself flying directly in front of my guns. This time, I didn't miss. My 37mm cannon and 4 .30 caliber machine guns converged on the Zero's fuselage at point-blank range. The high explosive shells from my main gun tore through the fighter's thin aluminum skin like it was paper, while my machine guns raked the cockpit area with devastating effect. The Zero's canopy exploded in a shower of plexiglass fragments, and I saw the pilot slump forward over his controls. The fighter rolled over and went straight down, hitting the ocean with a tremendous splash barely 100 yards from the burning convoy. "That's their leader," Rodriguez called out. "The others are breaking off." He was right. The remaining 3 Zeros, having lost their most experienced pilot, were climbing away from the battle and heading back toward their base. They'd had enough fighting for one morning, and frankly, so had we. I looked around at what remained of Blue Flight and felt a mixture of pride and sorrow. We'd started the mission with 7 aircraft and 7 pilots. Now we had 4 aircraft still flying, though 2 of them were seriously damaged. Walsh was gone, along with Lieutenant Dave Martinez, whose aircraft had been shot down during our initial attack on the convoy. But we'd accomplished our mission. Looking back at the Japanese convoy, I could see at least 6 destroyers either sinking or burning heavily. Several others were dead in the water, their crews fighting fires or trying to get their engines restarted. The convoy's tight formation had been completely broken, with surviving ships scattered across miles of ocean. "Blue Flight, this is Blue Leader," I transmitted. "Form up on me. We're going home." The flight back to Henderson Field gave use time to assess both the damage to our aircraft and the results of our mission. Rodriguez's P-400 had taken severe damage to its engine and was barely staying airborne. Tom Bradley's aircraft had dozens of holes in its wings and fuselage, but all major systems were still functioning. My own plane had been peppered with shrapnel, but the armor plating had done its job. As we approached Guadalcanal, I could see other aircraft from Major Robinson's Red Flight already in the landing pattern. Several were trailing smoke, and one was making an emergency landing with its landing gear stuck in the up position. The aerial battle at high altitude had been just as costly as our low-level attack on the convoy. Henderson Field looked like a scene from hell as we prepared to land. Crash trucks and ambulances were racing across the steel matting, while ground crews swarmed over damaged aircraft. Columns of black smoke rose from several wrecked P-400s that had attempted emergency landings. I brought my aircraft around in a gentle turn, lining up with the runway as my engine began to run rough from battle damage. The Allison V-1710 had taken several hits, and oil was beginning to stream back over my windscreen. But she held together long enough to get us home. The steel matting felt solid and reassuring beneath me wheels as I touched down and rolled to a stop near the revetments. Ground crews were already running toward our aircraft, eager to assess the damage and begin repairs for the next mission. But first, we had to count the cost of our victory. Staff Sergeant O'Sullivan was waiting beside my aircraft as I shut down the engine and climbed out of the cockpit. His weathered face showed a mixture of relief and concern as he looked over the battle damage to his beloved P-400. "Welcome back, Lieutenant," he said with his characteristic understatement. "Looks like you found some trouble out there." "That's one way to put it, Sully," I replied, pulling off my flight helmet and looking back at the holes in my aircraft's wings. "How many didn't make it back?" O'Sullivan's face darkened. "From your flight, we lost Lieutenant Walsh and Lieutenant Martinez. From Major Robinson's flight, we lost Captain Stevens, Lieutenant Cooper, and Lieutenant Anderson. Major Robinson made it back, but his aircraft is a total write-off. 5 aircraft and 5 pilots, nearly a quarter of our effective strength lost in a single mission. In the larger scheme of the Pacific War, it might seem like a small number. But to those of us who had flown with these men, shared tents with them, and watched them grow from frightened replacements into seasoned veterans, each loss was a personal tragedy. Later that afternoon, the full results of our mission became clear through reconnaissance photos and radio intercepts. The Japanese convoy had been decimated. 6 destroyers had been sunk outright, while 4 others were so heavily damaged they had to turn back to Rabaul for repairs. Most importantly, the supplies and reinforcements they were carrying never reached enemy forces in the Solomons. The intelligence reports that came in over the following days painted an even more complete picture of our success. The destroyed ships had been carrying critical ammunition, spare parts, and reinforcements intended to support a major Japanese offensive against our positions on Guadalcanal. Without those supplies, the enemy was forced to postpone their planned attacks for several weeks. But perhaps the most significant result of our mission was the psychological impact on enemy morale. The Japanese had grown accustomed to their naval convoys moving freely through the Solomon Islands, protected by overwhelming air superiority. Our successful attack demonstrated that even their most heavily escorted formations were vulnerable to determined American air power. 3 days after the mission, I was sitting in our squadron tent writing letters to the families of the men we'd lost when Major Robinson approached my bunk. His left arm was in a sling from injuries sustained in the aerial battle, but his spirits seemed surprisingly good. "Johnny," he said, settling onto a wooden crate that served as our makeshift furniture, "I just got word from headquarters. They want a full report on the convoy attack for the war correspondents back home." I looked up from the letter I was writing to Walsh's parents back in Chicago. What could I possibly say that would explain their son's sacrifice to people who had never experienced the terror and chaos of aerial combat? "What kind of report, sir?" I asked. "The usual thing, heroic American pilots defeating overwhelming odds, striking a blow for freedom, that sort of thing. You know how the newspapers like their stories." Robinson's tone suggested he had mixed feelings about turning our mission into propaganda, and I understood why. The reality of what we'd accomplished was both more complex and more meaningful than any newspaper account could capture. "Sir, what really happened out there was that a bunch of scared young men climbed into worn-out aircraft and did their jobs," I said finally. "We lost good friends, but we stopped the enemy from reinforcing their positions." "I'm not sure that makes for very exciting grading." Robinson nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe that's exactly what makes it worth writing about, Johnny. People back home need to understand that this war isn't being won by Hollywood heroes or miraculous weapons. It's being won by ordinary Americans doing extraordinary things under impossible circumstances." He was right, of course. The men who had died in the convoy attack weren't superhuman. They were mechanics and farmers, college students and store clerks who had learned to fly fighters and found the courage to face death in defense of their country and their comrades. Over the following weeks, replacements began arriving to fill the gaps in our squadron roster. Most were fresh from flight training in the States, wide-eyed young men who still believed that aerial combat was glamorous and exciting. It fell to those of us who had survived to teach them the hard realities of warfare in the Pacific. The war continued, of course. More missions, more battles, more friends lost and victories won. But the convoy attack of February 7, 1943, remained a turning point in the campaign for the Solomon Islands. It demonstrated that American air power could strike effectively against even the most heavily defended enemy formations, and it marked the beginning of the end for Japanese naval supremacy in the South Pacific. By the time I completed my combat tour and rotated back to the States in May 1943, the strategic situation had changed dramatically. American forces were no longer fighting desperately to hold isolated outposts like Henderson Field. Instead, we were on the offensive, island hopping toward the Japanese home islands with overwhelming superiority in aircraft, ships, and trained personnel. The P-400 Airacobra was eventually replaced by newer and more capable fighters, P-38 Lightnings, F-4 Corsairs, and P-51 Mustangs that could match or exceed the performance of enemy aircraft. But during those dark early days of the Pacific War, when the outcome of the entire conflict hung in the balance, our ungainly iron birds and the men who flew them held the line. Looking back now, more than 70 years later, I understand that our success in the convoy attack wasn't just about superior tactics or better equipment. It was about the willingness of ordinary Americans to sacrifice themselves for a cause larger than their individual lives. Billy Walsh, diving his burning fighter into an enemy destroyer, represented the best of what our generation had to offer. The Japanese Zero was indeed a formidable opponent, fast, maneuverable, and flown by experienced pilots. But it had one crucial weakness that its designers never anticipated. It was fighting against men who believed deeply in what they were fighting for. Our P-400s might have been outclassed technically, but they carried something no amount of engineering could provide: the determination of free men defending their homeland and their way of life. Everyone said we couldn't beat the Zeros. On that February morning over the Solomon Sea, flying our battered Airacobras into the teeth of overwhelming enemy opposition, we proved them wrong. We paid a terrible price for that victory, but it was a price we were willing to pay. The flames that consumed Billy Walsh's aircraft as it struck the Japanese destroyer were more than just the explosion of fuel and ammunition. They were the fire of American resolve, the light of freedom burning bright in the darkest hours of our nation's history. That fire, kindled by ordinary men doing extraordinary things, would eventually illuminate the path to victory across the entire Pacific. In the end, that's what the Pacific War was really about, not the technical specifications of aircraft or the grand strategies of generals, but the courage of individual human beings willing to risk everything for the principles they held dear. The men who flew the convoy attack mission of February 7, 1943, embodied those principles in the most profound way possible. They flew into combat knowing the odds were against them. They pressed their attacks in the face of withering enemy fire. And when the ultimate sacrifice was required, they gave their lives without hesitation to ensure that the cause of freedom would ultimately prevail. That morning, high above the Solomon Sea, we proved that courage and determination could triumph over technical superiority. We showed the world that the American spirit, embodied in the hearts of ordinary young men, was indeed unconquerable. Everyone said we couldn't beat the Zeros. We proved them wrong.